This is Baby Home 13, where most of our activity occurred. Chris preceded me to Russia by 2 trips. And when I first saw this, I said, what's wrong with this? I mean, it's bright, it's clean, the kids are well dressed, they're active. Upon investigation, the nutrition, medical care, sanitation were okay. Agreed, not all orphanages look like this. We've been in some in Latin America and in China that were pretty desperate. But these look pretty good. And Chris said to me, it's not what you see, it's what you don't see. Well, what don't you see? There's no warm, sensitive, responsive caregiver-child interactions. There's no response to crying. If they cry, they leave them in the crib. They'll fall asleep. Yeah. There's almost no talking between caregivers and kids. There's no reciprocal conversation of a verbal or a nonverbal nature. And there's no individuation of caregiving. By any definition, this is extreme neglect. And there are 2 to 8 million children in the world who live under these circumstances. And neglect is the world's most common maltreatment of children. Okay, what does this look like? Well, the kids were in playpens, so the caregivers don't have to pay attention to them on the ground. The caregivers do their job, but they don't play with the kids. Or they show them how to use a toy, and by God, you use it this way. It's very caregiver directed. Yes, that way. And feeding can barely be watched. 12 giant spoons go into the mouth every minute, ready or not, swallowing it or not. And some kids are leaning back, and they learn not to choke on this, but it's pretty difficult if you were doing it. Almost no talking, almost no smiling, no emotional expression, just doing their job in what I call a businesslike, perfunctory manner. And ready or not, here it comes. And actually, children from these orphanages have something of a fear of a bath because they get sprayed. Ready or not, here it comes. What does it do to a child to live under these circumstances in terms of their physical growth, their cognitive, language development, executive functioning, attachment, social emotional development, problem behavior, both while they are residents in the orphanage and after they get out, in our case, adopted to the United States or placed in families in Russia. We took, over the 2 decades, 4 approaches. There are, of course, other people in the country and elsewhere in Europe who have studied orphanage children, and they've contributed immensely to the literature. But by and large, they used only one of these strategies. So the first strategy was to empirically describe the caregivers the orphanage and the children and their development. Well, duh. But in this literature, there are almost no such studies. The independent variable, the thing we're studying, all we know about is this kid was in an orphanage. We don't know what the orphanage was like. We described it. Second, we studied post-institutionalized children who were adopted to USA families. That is what most of the literature, other than ours, is about. But we also conducted a quasi-experimental intervention using existing staff in an orphanage. And then we followed up children who were in that intervention and the comparison group after they were adopted to US families and placed in Russian families. Well, this collection has certain unique features to it. Most of the children were from 3 baby homes or very similar institutions. We know empirically the nature of their early experience, much more than most such studies in the literature. Most of these children and the institutions were selected by the same adoption agency, International Assistance Group in Pittsburgh. And we focused on the role of caregiver-child interaction on the children's development. Now, this kind of homogeneous strategy cuts down on extraneous variability, because in the literature, one study has kids from Czechoslovakia, another one from so-and-so, at various ages. They're all over the place. And the result is that literature is very contradictory, one study to the next, because of these parameters. We minimize those by having uniformity in these characteristics. But of course, the other side of that is maybe our results are unique to our particular set of circumstances. And I will show you a little bit in this, but there is more evidence that our results are not unique, but quite consistent with the general nature of the rest of the literature. Okay, let's describe the baby home, the caregivers, and what it's like to be there, although you've seen a good part of it already. This was the largest, most comprehensive study of an orphanage in the modern era. Most of the descriptions are narrative, casual, anecdotal reports. This was of 3 baby homes, most studies are 1, 306 caregivers, and 426 children. These samples are monstrous relative to the rest of the literature. All right, what's the character of the baby home? Well, there are about 12 children per room or ward. They're relatively homogeneous in age and in disability status. The children with disabilities are in a separate ward, and in some parts of the world in a separate orphanage. Because they are the same age, roughly, the children are graduated every so often to a new group of peers and caregivers who are children of a more advanced age, and this can occur at 6, 12, 24 months of age. Further, the caregivers, well, there are 12 caregivers per group, okay, but only 2 are there during the day. This is 2 caregivers for 12 kids, and some of those kids are infants in the first year of life. Our ratio is about 3 to 1 in childcare. Also, the caregivers work 16 to 24-hour shifts, and then they're off for 3 days. The result is no child sees the same caregiver today as they saw yesterday or see tomorrow. They have 16% turnover, 52 to 55 days of vacation a year. They don't pay them very well. The result is, by actual count in our studies, if a child arrives at this orphanage in the first month or so of life and stays till 19 months, he or she has seen 60 to 100 different caregivers. What about the children? 72% have one or more birth complications before they came to the orphanage. You can see that their birth weight is substantially less than the average Russian birth to a family. 63% of the children come directly from the birth hospital. 29% have spent a little time with a family. The rest come from specialty hospitals. They had a particular medical condition. The average age at intake is almost 5.5 months, but as you can see, the range is from a few months to a little more than 3 years. Why do kids come to the orphanage? Some of it is a leftover from the Soviet era. In Soviet times, adults were to work for the state. Okay, we know you have to have children, and if you can take care of them, that's fine. But if you have a problem, give them up to the orphanage, we'll rear them, and you go to work. So nurses in the neonatal ward rather quickly suggest giving the baby up, and it's very easy to give it up in Russia in contrast to the United States. Most of the reasons are economic. Family just can't afford this child. There might have been a teen mother. There may be drug and alcohol problems. There can be a child with disabilities. Children with disabilities are shunned in Russian society, just as they were 30, 40 years ago in the United States. And there's some involuntary relinquishment for severe neglect and abuse. What does this environment do to a child? Well, on the left here is physical growth of resident children from St. Petersburg orphanages, ours, those in Budapest, Latin America. What we have here is percentile rank, the average percentile rank of the kids in these groups. So for USA parent-reared children, the average percentile rank would be 50%. Children in these orphanages, in their physical growth, are about 10%. Here is behavioral development on something like the Battelle Developmental Inventory. And you can see from St. Petersburg in Latin America, it's about the same. What this shows is that 9 out of 10 family-reared children would be more advanced in their physical and behavioral development than the average child in the orphanage. These children also display a variety of atypical behaviors that you will not see in an American child care center. For one, they display a great deal of indiscriminate friendliness. You walk into a ward and there'll be 1, 2, or 3 kids who will come up and give you a hug and so forth. And then come back. We actually have video of that. Should have had it in there. It's a riot. And this is one of the most persistent characteristics of orphanage children, that they display, even after they're adopted for a long time, some indiscriminate friendliness. They also show stereotypic behavior and self-stimulating. A lot of rocking, sometimes head banging, flailing of the arms repetitively, and so forth. There's blank staring and inactivity. The eyes don't follow anything going on in the room. They just stand there and look. I mean, it's striking you see this. Huh? Some have behavioral control problems, which can be aggressiveness, running around out of control, or withdrawn behavior. Go into the ward and there's a little girl sitting under the table, sucking her thumb instead. And they have higher rates of psychiatric problems. Okay. That's what children are like while they are residents of the institution. What happens after they get adopted? In our case, to USA families, these families are fairly well educated and rather affluent. These are a cut of the best America has to offer, and they want these children. We collected a lot of data in 4 waves, starting in 2001 and ending in 2010. We mailed questionnaires to all of the parents on the International Assistance Agency, the adoption agency's mailing list, each time in those 4 years. So some parents actually got a survey 2, 3, even 4 times. These children were mostly, but not totally, from the 3 baby homes I just described. Now, because we mailed it to everybody on their list, regardless of what year they adopted children, the children varied in age from a few months to 18 years. We have 1,473 individual children in this database. Most studies are 50 to 100. Now, in fairness, because they were all different ages, and because, let's say, we only assess attachment in the first 2 years or so, for any single measure, we don't have 1,400 kids. Fewer, but even then, we have a very large sample. What did we assess? Attachment and indiscriminate friendliness. Executive functioning. Executive functioning is kind of impulsivity, inhibitory control, attention, focusing, that sort of thing. There's social emotional behavior and behavior problems, using instruments that assess a parent's recognition that the child bedwets, or, common kinds of behavioral issues. Social skills and their degree of relationship with their parents, with their siblings, and with their peers, and their mental and language development. Now, we get criticized fairly roundly because almost all of these assessments, but if you look carefully, some were not parent report, but most are simply the reports of parents. Well, can you trust those? Aren't they biased? No. They do reflect the particular experience that parent has with the child. So if you ask mothers and fathers to rate their kids, their ratings are correlated but not identical. And if you have teachers rate them, they're correlated too, but they're not identical. Why? Because some kids behave differently at school than at home. Well, we thought a parent's perception, especially the mother, was a good context and a good experiential background to do these ratings. We had a response rate of 40%. Actually, in this business, that's pretty good. Now then, there's another possible bias, and that is, how do you know the parents who respond to your questionnaires aren't the parents of kids who have more problems, or parents of kids who have fewer problems? So we actually did a study to determine that. I thought it was very clever, but I won't describe it to you. I ripped it off as something. I didn't make it up. But generally speaking, parents who sent in one questionnaire rated their child's general adjustment in the family, with peers, with siblings, with the parent, the same as parents who sent in no questionnaire. So we don't believe we have a biased sample of parents in that regard. All right, what are these kids like after they're adopted? Well, in terms of attachment, our study and that of several others suggests the following. Children who are adopted between 12 and 18 months of age form typical attachments within 8 to 12 months of their adoptive parents. Children who are adopted a little bit later and therefore have spent a little more time in the institution and perhaps have spent some important months of their life developmentally in the institution, you'll see what I mean in a minute, they tend to take a little longer forming attachments. They sometimes have irregularities in their social emotional behavior. They display more indiscriminate friendliness, and they have more behavioral problems. That is, they have higher rates of them. That doesn't mean they all have them at all, just higher rates. Here, for example, is the child behavior checklist. This is a 100+ item thing. Does your child yell and scream a lot? Does he beat up kids? The standard sorts of things parents would worry about. Okay. On the left is a scale on this for internalizing behavior. Internalizing behavior is shyness, anxiety, withdrawn, kind of asocial, and so forth. Over here is externalizing behavior. Just the opposite. Kid's out of control, a little aggressive, can't control this kid. Okay, now, the red bars are for children adopted after 18 months of age. The blue bars are for children who were adopted before 18 months of age. The two sets of bars on each side reflect kids who were assessed between 6 and 11 years of age versus kids who were assessed in adolescence. So what do we have here? Well, the obvious thing is the red bars are higher than the blue bars. Kids who were adopted after 18 months have much higher rates of internalizing and externalizing behavior than kids who were adopted before 18 months. Also, there's a tendency for there to be more problem behavior, especially in that late adoption group when they're adolescents. But note the axis, it's a little hard to see. This is 30, what you have here, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you what the heck we got here. This is the percentage of borderline clinical kids. That is, they have enough problem behavior to be in the worst 15% of American families. This is pretty severe stuff now. But this is 30%. This is 40%. This means that more than half don't have these problems, even among kids who were adopted at the older age. Moreover, one study that we did showed that half of the parents who have a kid who's clinical and borderline did not seek professional help, despite the fact that these parents can actually seek professional help at a greater frequency than most parents in American society. And another study showed that when you ask parents of these kids if the kid is disrupting the family, they say, oh no, he's got a few strange behaviors, but we're okay. Point. Even kids who spend more than 18 months, their first 18 months, in an institution of the kind I described, do not have these problems. Now, the important thing, the next graph is the most scientifically provocative I got. So, wake up now. Okay. The point here was 18 months, age at adoption. That age is different for children coming from different orphanages. Orphanages that vary in how severely deficient they are. So I'm going to tell you what the next slide shows, because it's a little complicated. It shows the more severe the orphanage, the earlier they show this, this increase. By the way, what I just showed you, that graph, is true for all of the subscales of different kinds of behavior problems. It's all the same. Also, there's a lot of what we call comorbidity. That means if you're high on one of these problems, you're probably high on another one. And in fact, for those of you who know what factor analysis is, if you factor analyze these subscales, you get one factor altogether. They all kind of correlate with one another, except attention problems, which is the most severe, and it's a little bit different. This has provoked the speculation that there is one underlying cause to this that undergirds social emotional development and behavior problems. Okay, now, look, here's executive functioning. This is not the slide I foreshadowed, sorry. This is executive functioning. The brief is a parent response measure of executive function. Look, 18 months. Whoa. I've been in this business for 52 years. You don't see something like this. Why isn't it the longer, these buttons are right together. Why isn't it that the longer you're in the orphanage, progressively the worse you get? No. Notice, you don't get worse even within the first 18 months the longer you're there. And you don't get worse after 18 months the longer you're there. This is bizarre. And it's also true of low social skills. Admitted, this is the same population, but look, 18 months. Now my graph. Okay. This is the percent extreme CBCL scores, percent extreme problem behavior. That's what we got here. Okay? Now, this is age at adoption. Less than 9 months, 9 to 17, 18 to 26, more than 27 months. The green bars are for children who were adopted from the 1990s Romanian orphanages after Ceausescu was deposed of power. They were the worst we know of. Their rates of problem behaviors go up after 9 months. Actually, Michael Rudder's study in England shows 6 months in his sample of these kids. This is not the only study that shows that for that group of people. The magenta is our study. Oh, 18 months, boom. The blue is for Megan Gunner's study of all adoptions in the state of Minnesota from anywhere. And it's heavily laden with children from South Korea, which is supposed to have much better orphanages, and China, which was hypothesized to send very good children, lest China be embarrassed for sending bad children. And they don't show their step function here until 24 to 27 months. There are other specific long-term deficiencies, which means greater likelihood. Not everybody. First of all, these are not all our studies. There is atypical brain development, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, in the amygdala, and in the hippocampus. There's poor executive functioning, attention, memory, cognitive control, and inhibition. There's hyperactivity and quasi-autism. They call it quasi because it's probably not autism, but they look like it. Poorer emotional regulation and anxiety. Poorer attachment and more indiscriminate friendliness, and more comorbidity. But not everybody. What produces these characteristics, or at least the higher frequency of these kinds of behaviors? Early in this literature, people said, oh, well, look, who sends their kid to the orphanage? This is a kind of deficient gene pool. These kids have birth complications, we showed it. Low birth weight, prematurity, ventilation, etc. And some of them have family experiences in which some of them were abused and neglected. What do you expect? Well, I'm here to try to convince you that while those characteristics, of course, yes, that one. While these characteristics and experiences do influence a child's development when they're in the institution, but those children who are adopted are selected. And almost all studies of post-institutionalized children do not find relationships between genes, perinatal conditions, even alcohol, prenatal alcohol and drug exposure, because the worst kids aren't adopted. So that's not what's doing this. And you'll see in a minute, it's not primarily nutrition, sanitation, medical care, and toys and equipment. It is caregiver-child interactions are likely the most important. And I'll spend the rest of the afternoon convincing you of that. There's not much theory in this game. A lot of researchers float attachment theory because John Bowlby, the patriarch of attachment theory, actually made his initial observations in orphanages. But This is a popular hypothesis. There is evidence for each, damn it, for each link here, but not for the whole thing. So, a good hypothesis is that poor caregiving leads to persistent and chronic stress in kids, and we do know from studies that orphanage children have more stress. That stress leads to high levels of cortisol, hormone that runs around in the body. And whether or not a kid actually develops high levels of cortisol depends on, in part, genetics. But there are two kinds of genetics. There's the kind you and I were trained on. Gregor Mendel, you know, and the pea pods or whatever he had. And we all learned you get dealt a deck of genetic cards, you got it, and you develop the particular phenotype, characteristic that gene has, and there's no changing going on. Well, that's not quite true. You need some environment for any genetic effect. But the second kind of genetics is called epigenetics. It's on top of Gregor Mendel's genetics. This is bizarre, because what happens is that in the face of certain experiences, enough of them, there are neurochemical changes that take place that determine whether one of those original genes actually produces its designated outcome or not. That is what the step function suggests. You get enough of this stressful environment, and if it's really bad, you don't need much. If it's less bad, you need it more exposure. And then, boom, epigenetics kicks in, and suddenly you have a disposition that's going to last a while. What does that look like? Those high levels of cortisol have been shown to lead to at least three kinds of outcomes. First of all, there's poor metabolism of nutrients. You never saw little kids eat so much in your life, even when they have a chance to feed themselves. They're woofing it down. But remember those early panels that I showed you? They don't grow. They don't metabolize the food as efficiently as the rest of us. Next, there's poor antibody production. These kids get all the standard immunizations. But if you test them later for their immunity, it's much less than you would expect in family-reared kids. And finally, they have that atypical brain development. So these things lead to the behavioral or observational characteristics of these kids. They have poor physical growth, poor health and immunity, and poor mental skills and behavioral control. That's our best guess as to what happens. What produces these outcomes? It's the poor caregiver-child interactions and the lack of relationships with caregivers. How do we know that? Well, we did an intervention study. Look at this table. This compares families on 7 characteristics that you and I, sitting in our armchair, would say are important contributors to a child's typical development in a family. In good families, you have these characteristics. But in orphanages, you have the opposite. So, in a family, you have few kids. In the orphanage, you have a lot. Ages and developmental status are mixed in families. They're not mixed in the orphanage. The children to caregiver ratio was low in a family, it's high in the orphanage. There are few caregivers, many in the orphanage. And the consistency of caregivers is high in a family and low in the orphanage. These characteristics here are the structural characteristics of the orphanage. Its physical characteristics, big groups, etc., and the employment practices of the caregivers. This is caregiver behavior. So Chris led the construction of the intervention in an orphanage, Baby Home 13, that you saw at the beginning of this talk. So we created smaller groups, 6 and 7 kids instead of 12 to 14. We mixed the ages and disabilities. Scared the heck out of the caregivers at first. They said, we can't take kids with different ages, and what do I do with this kid with cerebral palsy? Well, I don't know. Most parents don't have their whole brood in one shot. Somehow everybody else is coping with mixed ages. We had fewer and more consistent caregivers. We had 6 caregivers assigned to those smaller groups, each smaller group. And instead of 9 to 12 per week, and so a kid saw in the first 19 months 30 instead of 60 to 100 kids. Now that's not ideal. We understand that. This is the best we could pull off. Okay? We got rid of the graduations. You didn't need them anymore. The groups were age mixed. Yeah? And we instituted family hour. There are a lot of adults running around in an orphanage, barging into the room to give them a little massage. There's a music teacher. There's somebody who operates that pool, etc. So 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the afternoon. The doors are locked, no visitors, and the kids are with their primary caregivers. And that's here. 2 caregivers per small group were labeled primary caregivers. They worked 40 or so hours a week in overlapping shifts. And then on the weekend, one was there most of the time. The other one was there most of the time. The net result was one of these 2 primary caregivers was there every day for most of the waking hours. So this was our attempt, primary attempt, to have a few consistent caregivers. Importantly, no change in nutrition, in medical care, in who came to the orphanage. All of those variables, like poor birth circumstance, they're all thrown in a pot. What I just showed you was an attempt to make the orphanage more family-like. That table I showed you was exactly what we did. We made the orphanage more family-like. That last item, warm, sensitive, caring, engaged, that's parent-like. So we trained parents to be more engaged, sensitive, responsive, child-directed instead of caregiver-directed. Respond to the child. Imitate them. That's a good response. Talk to them. Have verbal and nonverbal reciprocal conversation. Be warm, caring, and display appropriate affect. Institutional kids have flat affect, except for a few who go off the handle. Why? Because the caregivers display no affect. And especially that's true in Russia. They're stone-faced most of the day. We trained the caregivers in this general style. Yes, there were examples of specific behaviors. When the child is crying, go to him. Okay. But generally, be engaged, sensitive, responsive, child-directed, etc. Why the general style and not specific behaviors? So the caregiver could adapt to each individual child, and so the caregiver could adapt as the children grew older. What does this look like? Well, there was face-to-face interactions. There was smiling. There was talking. Kids were fed a little more gently and slowly. Yeah, we're jumping around here. I'm sorry about that. And kids conversed, and they expected their caregiver to talk back to them, by God. There, you missed it. I'm sorry. This video is not playing very well. There was laughter. Kids with disabilities were positioned so they could at least see what was going on in the room instead of left alone in the crib. Caregivers were having a good time, and so were the kids. And caregivers were child-directed. Oh no, come on, this is my favorite. This little Down syndrome boy is trying to comb hair. Okay, he found another subject over here. I'm sorry for this halting. Oops, he's got the comb upside down. So the caregiver follows his lead, turns the comb around, and then in great magnanimity offers her own head for him to comb. Now that's dangerous. And kids became wary, not of strangers, not the indiscriminate friendliness. And boy, she turned her back on me and she was going to have nothing to do with me. Now, people who don't know think this is strange behavior. We think this is typical. This is what you want. We had an evaluation. One heck of an evaluation. The most comprehensive you can imagine. We had 3 baby homes for children birth to 4 years of age. One baby home we called Training Plus Structural Changes. That was made more family-like and the caregivers to behave more parent-like. Then there was an institution that had only parent-like training of the caregivers, but we didn't change the structure. The structure was there to support interaction and relationships. And then we had a no intervention baby home. Now, agreed, these are not randomly assigned. But the directors of each of these 3 baby homes wanted to be in the group they were in, for whatever that says about it. They certainly weren't assigned to a group they didn't want. Well, what happened? This is the home inventory total score. The home reflects all kinds of characteristics of the ward. The number of toys around, all kinds of, in addition to caregiver-child interaction. You can see that our double intervention home actually started worse and then immediately went up. Some parent-like behavior helped a little, and the no intervention actually decreased. This line is the typical USA early care and education score. Yeah, they did pretty well. What about the kids? Physical growth. This is height and weight. This is for the double intervention versus the comparison. Be too messy if we put the other one on there. And you can see that height and weight progressively increased in the double intervention, approaching parent-reared level the longer kids were in the intervention. This is the best demonstration of the validity of the psychosocial short stature hypothesis. It's taken me years to be able to say that. It's the simple hypothesis that social interaction is necessary for typical physical growth. When we showed this kind of thing to the caregivers, to the pediatricians, they said you made up the data. They had no training or awareness of behavioral pediatrics. This was shocking to them. Here's the children's behavioral development. Same game. They started exactly the same. By the way, a DQ of 60 is 2 standard deviations below the mean. In parent-reared children, only about 2.5% would be that low. The longer they're in there, the better they are, and they even approached parent-reared norms. And here is the same graph for children with disabilities. Agreed, they're much lower. By the way, they get all kinds of disabilities. Admittedly, microcephaly and hydrocephaly kids did not show improvements, but all the rest of them, some of whom were very involved in their disability, showed an increase. This was shocking because the attitude of the directors, who are pediatricians, was there's nothing you can do for this kid. Oh yeah, there is. And the longer they were in, the better they got. Now those of you who know a little statistics know what an effect size is. Very simply, an effect size is how much improvement did you have relative to the variability in the group when you started. The effect size for kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities of this intervention approached the size of the effect for adoption. What we've demonstrated is the whole group of kids in the double intervention improved, kids in the no intervention did not. But how do we know it was really the characteristics of this intervention? There's such a thing as a mediation analysis, and basically what that says is, okay, you got the double intervention versus the no intervention, and you got that associated with outcome in their developmental scores. To what extent are these differences in outcome mediated or related to scores of each individual child's principal caregiver's scores on the home scale? 43% of that outcome was related to better caregiving. Given this scale, which measures all kinds of things other than caregiver-child interaction, that was amazing. There were this was a cluster intervention. We changed all kinds of things. Do some of the individual changes have an effect? Well, changing the caregivers and peers. Remember I said they graduated kids to new groups? Well, we lined them up on the age that they were changed to a new group versus the double intervention kids who weren't changed. You change a group, your developmental progress plateaus for the time around the change, and then eventually it increases. Furthermore, There's a study in Latin America that we evaluated, and it also showed that kids who changed groups improved less in their intervention. We also determined that caregiver responsivity and sensitivity and engagement was related to the children's improvement in cognitive development. But it took caregiver engagement, sensitivity, and responsivity plus fewer and consistent caregivers to produce social emotional developmental improvements. Think about attachment, makes sense. Okay. Whenever you do an intervention in the community, in an agency, you need to design it so that it can last and be maintained after you're done. And Chris insisted when we designed this project that we do certain things so that it could be maintained. The Russians were live, love, and be merry tomorrow. We don't know if Russia's going to be here. Let's throw the book at them now. Chris said no. What are the things you put into an intervention to help make it sustainable? Train the trainer so that the baby home could train new caregivers on their own when they came. Also, design the intervention so you do not hire extra caregivers or increase the hours of caregivers, just their schedules. As a result, 6 years after the money stopped and the intervention, formal intervention stopped, we assessed the kids and the orphanage, and the intervention was maintained. And the groups were still different from one another. Now then, did it last? That is, did children who were in our family-like, parent-like orphanage for at least 3 months and were adopted to USA families or placed in Russian families show any benefits years later relative to the kids in the no intervention orphanage? We ran 2 studies. One of Russian kids who went to Russian families and one to the USA families. We insisted that to qualify in here, the child had to spend 3 months in one of our intervention homes while the intervention was in effect, and for those 6 years after the intervention stopped. You'll notice that the kids in the Russian sample were placed on average at 2 years of age. In the USA, they were placed at 12 months of age, 1 year. But both groups spent about 3.5 years in their families. The Russian kids were assessed a little bit older than the American kids. What happened? We compared family and parent-like plus parent-like with no intervention. And the reason for that is over the years, the parent-like baby home got extra services to help them become more family-like. And they weren't totally family-like, but they moved in that direction. And their kids actually improved. Okay. The kids in the intervention homes had better attachment and less indiscriminate friendliness. They had better scores on internalizing, on dysregulation in their early years, and they had fewer behavior problems on the CBCL. The results of these 2 studies were not identical, but in these respects, they were similar. The intervention had a lasting effect. These differences occurred and were statistically significant, but these groups were within normal ranges. That doesn't mean individual children were in normal ranges, but the groups were. Okay, what did we learn in 2 decades? It's caregiver-child interaction that is crucial. Remember, there was no change in medical care, sanitation, nutrition, sample of kids who went to the orphanages, nothing. It was only the improvement of the caregiving. The psychosocial short stature hypothesis was confirmed. It's the best data they got. Neglect has a sort of sensitive period, roughly the first 2 years. Well, not quite the first 2, because the early months don't seem to make any difference. What happened to bonding in the hospital and the historical emphasis on the first months of life for the kid? It's important for the parent, but it doesn't seem to be all that important for the kid. Not until a bit later. There seems to be a cumulative deficiency phenomenon going on. That's the phenomena of severe orphanages. By 6 months, you're done in. Less severe, 18 months, etc. There's the hypothesized roles of genetics, both Mendelian and epigenetics. And through it all, however, do not forget, there is substantial resilience. Most psychologists would never have predicted that most of the children would survive that kind of an environment, even after 18 and 24 months, with no obvious effects, at least of the kind we measure. There's been some policy impact to these studies. First of all, the social-emotional type of intervention has been replicated in several places in Russia, in Latin America, and in China. These interventions were not like ours in specifics, but generally they tried to improve the caregiver-child interactions. Thanks to our Russian colleagues, the Russian legislature, the Duma, passed new regulations for baby homes throughout the country in which they mandated all of the family-like characteristics we implemented in the intervention. And our Russian colleagues have trained 300 professionals in 90 baby homes in being more parent-like. It's not often your study has that kind of policy impact. However, we are not always greeted with smiles and applause. And it's happened more than once. We went to Bogota, Colombia, presented. We have a representative here. And presented this. And when we were done, a woman stood up and said, "How dare you come to our country and present this kind of information? We don't want to improve orphanages here. We want to get rid of them." Talk about being on 60 Minutes. We have several answers to that. Yes, we believe every child deserves a loving, warm, sensitive, engaged family of consistent adults. We're all for it. But obviously not every family is like that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be vulnerable children sitting in the orphanage. Also, it takes a great deal of effort to deinstitutionalize. There are economic necessities. There are policies that have to be passed on whether and how much you pay parents to foster or adopt. Many countries don't want to pay adoptive parents. You need a professional social work, psychological infrastructure to support parents, to pick them, to train them, and then to deal with some of those problems we have just outlined. And you have children who are hard to place. Older children, children with disabilities, and those children need a specialized professional infrastructure. You've characterized our study as demonstrating that you can improve orphanages. Yeah, it shows that. But notice also that what this study did was take 6 of the major features of a good family and experimentally implement them and demonstrated that they produce typical development. Our study is the best evidence you have that families are the best thing for kids. It takes time to deinstitutionalize. The Republic of Georgia had everything going for it. It had money. It had administration that was awful. It had people who knew how to do this. It took them 10 years. We went on a consulting trip to the Ukraine. They had the same situation. Everything going for them. We were amazed. I mean, they had really good people at every level of government, in the orphanages, etc. After 5 years, they had placed 5,000 kids in families. When we interviewed the minister in charge of the orphanages, she said, "Oh yeah, and we're happy for those 5,000. But I have 60,000 still in the orphanage, and I don't get 1 cent more today than I did before." It's going to take time. And our position is we want to provide the best possible environment for all the children, and as soon as possible.